Your Honor, I owe the money. My wife died 2 years ago, and I worked 2 jobs just to keep my kids alive.
You know, people look at me and they think they know exactly who I am. They see the gavel, they hear the sharp voice, and they think I don't have a heart. After decades of sitting on this bench and handling thousands of cases, I've heard every excuse in the book. I deal in facts, and I hold people accountable because somebody has to. But every once in a while, a case comes before me that reminds me why I became a judge in the first place. It's not always about dropping the hammer. Sometimes it's about recognizing when someone is already entirely broken and deciding whether the justice system should crush them completely or give them a chance to breathe. Let me tell you about a morning I will never forget. A day when a single father walked into my courtroom fighting just to survive. But before I get into the details of this extraordinary case, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. The story I'm about to share is a reminder that behind the strict black and white rules of the law, there must always be room for humanity. You won't want to miss a single word of this. My mornings usually start exactly the same way. I am a creature of habit. I wake up early, review the day's docket, and walk into the courthouse ready to cut through the nonsense. When I put on this lace collar and step up to the bench, I am not there to be anyone's friend. I am there to find the truth. Bird, my trusted bailiff, knows my moods better than anyone. That morning, he handed me the files and gave me a knowing look. Most of the docket was standard fare. Unpaid loans, property disputes, neighbors bickering over a fence. But there was one file involving a severe debt and a string of missed payments that caught my eye. When Bird called the case, I watched the defendant walk to the podium. In my courtroom, body language tells me half the story before anyone even opens their mouth. I get the arrogant ones, the liars, the ones who stand tall because they think they can outsmart me. But this man, he walked up like he was carrying a boulder on his back. His suit was clean but frayed at the cuffs. His hands were calloused from hard labor. And his eyes were completely exhausted. He wasn't looking for a fight. He looked like a man who had already lost everything. And sitting quietly in the front row of the gallery, watching his every move, were his 3 young children. I adjusted my glasses and looked down at the paperwork. The debt was significant, and the violations were crystal clear. By all accounts, I should have ruled immediately and thrown the book at him. But my gut told me to wait. My gut told me to listen. I looked down at the paperwork in front of me, then back up at the man standing at the podium. I don't mince words, and I don't let people play games in my courtroom. I asked him directly, "Sir, you owe a substantial amount of money. You have missed multiple payments, ignored notices, and frankly, your financial record over the past year is an absolute disaster. Explain yourself." Usually, this is the part where people start talking over me. They start pointing fingers, making up wild stories, or playing the victim. If you've watched me for 5 minutes, you know that interrupting me is the fastest way to lose your case. But this man didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at me, took a deep, shaky breath, and said, "Your Honor, I have no excuses. I owe the money. I am fully responsible, but I am just trying to keep my kids alive." I paused, peering over my glasses. "What do you mean, keep them alive? Do you work?" I asked, keeping my tone firm. He told me he works 2 jobs a day shift loading trucks at a local warehouse and a night shift cleaning offices downtown. "Then where is the money going?" I demanded. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his head slightly and glanced back at the gallery. I followed his gaze. Sitting in the front row were his 3 children. The oldest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 10, had his thin arms wrapped protectively around his little sister. When the father turned back to me, I saw the raw, unfiltered pain in his eyes. "My wife passed away unexpectedly 2 years ago, Your Honor," he said quietly. "Since then, it's just been me. I work around the clock, but childcare is incredibly expensive. Rent just went up, and the week I missed that major payment. My youngest ended up in the emergency room with a severe asthma attack. I didn't have insurance that covered it. I had to choose between paying the hospital so my daughter could breathe or paying this debt. I chose my daughter." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Let me tell you something. I have seen every scam artist in the book try to use their children as a shield to get out of paying what they owe. People come in here every single day and spin tales of woe, hoping I'll let them off the hook. But you cannot fake the kind of bone-deep exhaustion this man had. You cannot fake the way his children looked at him, not with fear, but with absolute reliance and unwavering love. He wasn't asking for a handout. He was just a man drowning in a system that doesn't stop to ask why you're sinking. Before I go any further, let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever been pushed so far to the edge that you had to choose between your children's health and paying a basic bill? Have you ever felt the weight of the world crushing you while you tried to stay strong for your family? Leave a comment below and share your story. And if you're feeling the weight of this father's struggle, hit that like button. I asked him if he brought any proof of his income and those medical bills. He nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he handed a thick stack of crumpled papers to my bailiff, Bird. Bird walked them over to me, and the courtroom remained perfectly still as I put on my glasses and began to read through the documented financial panic of a single father trying to do the impossible. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning as I flipped through those crumpled pages. I am used to people handing me forged documents, fake receipts, and printouts that make absolutely no sense. But this stack of papers was a timeline of absolute heartbreak. I looked at his pay stubs first. The man wasn't lying about working around the clock. He had logged over 80 hours a week between the warehouse and his nighttime cleaning job. He was literally trading his sleep for minimum wage just to keep the lights on. Then, I turned to the medical bills. It was an invoice from the local emergency room, dated 3 weeks prior. The out-of-pocket cost for the nebulizer treatments, the emergency physician fee, and the prescribed asthma medication was astronomical. Finally, I looked at his bank statements. I ran my finger down the column of debits: rent, groceries, electricity, a modest payment to a child care center. At the very bottom of the page, his current available balance was printed in stark black ink, $14.36. I am known for telling people that bologna is what you buy at the deli. I look for the lie. I look for the lazy way out. I have spent my entire career sniffing out the people who want to cheat the system. But staring at these papers, the only thing I saw was a man breaking his own back to keep a roof over his children's heads. There was no fraud here. There was only the cruel reality of a system that punishes people for being poor and a father who was entirely out of options. I took off my glasses and set them down on the bench. I looked at the father, who was staring down at his battered work boots, just waiting for the hammer to fall. "Sir," I said, my voice losing that familiar sharp edge, "I am looking at a bank account with exactly $14.36 in it. How are you feeding those children?" He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening, as he fought to keep his dignity intact in a room full of strangers. "I get paid on Friday, Your Honor. We have enough rice, beans, and oatmeal in the pantry to make it until then. They never go hungry. I make sure they eat before I do." I glanced past him, looking at the 3 children sitting in the front row. The little girl, the one who had been in the hospital, was clutching a worn-out stuffed bear. Her older brother had his hand resting firmly on her shoulder, guarding her. They were quiet, well-behaved, and completely terrified of the woman in the black robe sitting up high. They thought I was going to take their father away. In that moment, the paperwork didn't matter. The strict letter of the law didn't matter. The law dictates that a debt is a debt, and a creditor is entitled to their money. But justice? Justice requires looking at the human being standing in front of you and recognizing when the rules are about to destroy a family that is already barely holding on. I turned my attention to the plaintiff standing on the other side of the courtroom. It was a representative from the collection agency, a young man in a sharp, expensive suit who had been tapping his pen impatiently on the podium this entire time. He didn't see a grieving father doing his best. He only saw a spreadsheet, a delinquent account, and a bottom line. "Your Honor," the representative began, his voice dripping with that rehearsed corporate confidence, "while we sympathize with the defendant's personal situation, a contract is a contract. We are asking for the full amount owed, plus all accumulated late fees and court costs. Furthermore, we would like to request an immediate garnishment of his wages to satisfy this debt." I stared at him. Sometimes, the sheer audacity of people in my courtroom leaves me absolutely speechless. But usually, that silence only lasts for about a second. "You want to garnish his wages?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "Did you not just hear a single word of what was said in this room? Did you not just see the bank statements I reviewed? This man is working 80 hours a week and eating leftover rice so his kids don't starve. He has $14.36 to his name. You want me to authorize taking the literal food out of those children's mouths so your agency can hit its monthly collection quota?" The representative bristled, straightening his tie and trying to stand his ground against me. "Your Honor, with all due respect, The law clearly states. I know exactly what the law states. I snapped, slamming my hand flat on the desk. The sharp crack echoed through the silent room, making the young man physically jump. I have been practicing the law since before you were born. Do not stand there in my courtroom and attempt to quote the law to me. The law is meant to be a tool for justice, not a weapon used to completely destroy a family that is already on the absolute brink of collapse. I looked at the plaintiff, stripping away his corporate shield with a single, unwavering glare. There is an old saying, you cannot get blood from a turnip. You can demand to garnish his wages all you want, but if he loses his apartment because he can't pay rent, and if he loses custody of his children because he can no longer afford to feed them, you still aren't getting your money. All you will have accomplished is ruining 4 human lives over an unforeseeable medical emergency. The representative opened his mouth to argue, but I immediately held up my hand, pointing a warning finger at him. Ah, we are done here. You are going to zip your lips. Do not speak again unless I ask you a direct question. Do we understand each other? He nodded quickly, stepping back from his podium. I took a deep breath, letting the heavy silence settle over the room once again. I looked back at the single father. He had his head bowed, his calloused hands gripping the edges of the wooden podium so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was standing there, shaking slightly, waiting for the system to finalize his ruin. But I had made my decision. I turned my gaze back to the defendant. He looked like a man bracing for a physical blow, his entire body tense, waiting for the system to finalize his ruin. Sir, I said, my voice softening just enough to let him know the storm wasn't headed his way. Look at me. He raised his head slowly, and I saw tears pooling in his exhausted, bloodshot eyes. He had spent the last 2 years holding his family's world together with duct tape and sheer willpower, terrified that at any moment it would all fall apart. You are not a deadbeat, I told him clearly, making sure the words carried to every corner of that silent room. A deadbeat is someone who runs from their responsibilities. A deadbeat makes excuses. You ran toward your responsibilities. You took on 2 grueling jobs. You fed your children before you fed yourself. When an unforeseeable tragedy struck, you made a choice to keep your little girl breathing rather than pay a faceless corporation on time. In my book, that doesn't make you a delinquent. That makes you a father, and a damn good one at that. I picked up my pen, uncapped it, and wrote deliberately across the front of the plaintiff's complaint. I am dismissing this case in its entirety, I announced, my voice steady and resolute. With prejudice. That means this collection agency cannot come after you for this specific debt ever again. There will be no wage garnishment. There will be no late fees, no court costs, no penalties. You are walking out of this courtroom owing them absolutely nothing. The father let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. His knees actually buckled a fraction of an inch, and he had to grip the wooden podium even tighter just to stay standing. The massive, suffocating burden he had been carrying for 2 agonizing years suddenly dropped from his shoulders. He covered his mouth with his calloused hand, the tears finally spilling over. In the front row, his oldest boy didn't fully understand the complex legal jargon, but he understood my tone. More importantly, he understood the profound relief suddenly washing over his father's face. The young boy smiled brightly, the tension leaving his small shoulders, and he wrapped his arms tightly around his little sister. I leaned forward, looking directly into the father's eyes. People think the law is just a rigid set of rules, a cold machine completely devoid of human context. But the law is administered by human beings. And if a judge cannot look at a grieving widower who is sacrificing his own life and health to raise 3 children and find a single shred of mercy, then that judge has no business sitting on this bench. Go home, sir. Take care of those beautiful kids. You are dismissed. The father didn't move at first. It was as if his exhausted brain simply couldn't process the fact that the crushing weight he had carried for 2 excruciating years was suddenly gone. He looked up at me, wiping his wet face with the back of his frayed sleeve, and whispered a thank you, Your Honor, that barely made it past his trembling lips. I gave him a single, curt nod. I don't need gratitude. I just need people to do the right thing. Don't thank me, sir, I told him. Just keep doing right by those kids. He turned away from the podium and walked back to the heavy wooden benches where his children were waiting. His youngest daughter, still clutching her worn-out stuffed bear, reached her little arms up to him. He scooped her up, burying his face in her shoulder, while his oldest son wrapped his arms fiercely around his waist. It was a deeply private, raw moment happening in a very public room, but for a few seconds, the rest of the world completely ceased to exist for that family. On the other side of the aisle, The collection agency representative was aggressively shoving his spreadsheets back into his expensive leather briefcase. He was red in the face, humiliated, and clearly furious that he had lost not just his commission, but his pride in front of a packed room. As he snapped his briefcase shut and turned to march out of the courtroom, I leaned into my microphone. "And sir?" I called out, my voice slicing through the room and stopping him dead in his tracks. He froze, looking back over his shoulder with a tight jaw. "If I ever see your agency bring a case like this into my courtroom again, trying to bleed a stone dry while completely ignoring the blatant human reality of the situation, I won't just dismiss it. I will make sure the court sanctions cost your company a lot more than $14.36. Now get out." He didn't say a single word. He just pushed through the swinging wooden doors and disappeared into the hallway. Bird, who has stood by my side as my bailiff through thousands of grueling cases, walked over to the father. Bird is a big, physically intimidating man, but anyone who truly knows him knows he has the heart of a saint. He gently placed a large hand on the father's back and guided the family toward the exit, murmuring something encouraging to the oldest boy that made the kid stand a little taller. The gallery, which is usually filled with the restless murmurs, coughing, and impatient shuffling of people waiting for their turn at the podium, was completely dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the hardwood floor. The people sitting there weren't just watching a legal proceeding anymore. They had just witnessed a man literally get his life back. I took a slow sip of my water, leaning back in my leather chair and letting the silence linger. I needed a moment to breathe, and frankly, so did everyone else in that room. When the morning session finally concluded, I retreated to my chambers and took off my robe. Let me tell you, after decades on the bench, you learn to leave the emotional baggage of the courtroom at the door. Otherwise, this job will absolutely eat you alive. But that day, the weight of the black robe felt a little heavier than usual. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, sat at my heavy wooden desk, and looked out the window at the busy city streets below. I thought about how many people were walking around out there right at that moment, carrying invisible, suffocating burdens, just like that father. How many hardworking people are just one medical emergency, one missed paycheck, or one bad break away from total financial and emotional ruin? My bailiff, Bird, knocked lightly on the doorframe and stepped into the room. He didn't say much after all these years working together. He rarely needs to. He just set the thick stack of afternoon files on my desk, sighed, and shook his head. "That was a close one, Judge," he murmured quietly. I nodded in agreement. It was entirely too close. If that single father had walked into a courtroom with a judge who only looked at the black and white numbers on a spreadsheet, he would have walked out a completely broken man. The state would have authorized the garnishment of his meager wages. Without that money, he would have been evicted from his apartment. Child Protective Services would have inevitably been called due to homelessness, and those three beautiful, innocent children would have been absorbed into a cold, bureaucratic foster system, all over a hospital bill and a predatory late fee. Is that what we call justice? Ruining 4 human lives to satisfy a corporate ledger? Not in my courtroom, not on my watch. I have always told people that they don't put you in this chair just to be a rubber stamp for corporations. They put a human being on the bench to exercise human judgment. The law must have a pulse, it must have a conscience, and it must possess the ability to distinguish between a malicious act and a desperate attempt to survive. Before I share the final resolution of this family's story, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever experienced a moment in your life where someone gave you a second chance when they absolutely didn't have to? A moment where grace and understanding stepped in when you were fully expecting punishment? Go down into the comments right now and tell me your story. I read them, and I want to know how a simple act of compassion changed the trajectory of your life. About 6 months after that emotional morning in court, a small, unmarked envelope arrived at the courthouse. It wasn't an official legal motion, a complaint, or a court summons. It was a standard white envelope with my name written across the front in careful, deliberate handwriting. When I opened it, what I found inside validated every single instinct I had on that day. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter on plain lined paper and a small, brightly colored crayon drawing folded in half. It was a picture of a tall man holding hands with a young boy and a little girl, standing under a bright yellow sun. Written at the very top of the page in clumsy, uneven children's handwriting were the words, "Thank you for saving my dad." I set the drawing down on my desk and read the letter. The father wrote to tell me that in the 6 months since our court date, his life had completely turned around. Without the crushing weight of that massive debt, and the terrifying threat of a wage garnishment hanging over his head, he was finally able to breathe. He had used the small amount of money he saved to finish a vocational certification program. Because of that, he had just been promoted to a daytime managerial position at the warehouse. He no longer had to work the grueling night shift cleaning offices. For the first time in 2 years, he was putting his children to bed every single night and waking up to make them breakfast every morning. He wrote, "Your Honor, you didn't just dismiss a court case that day. You gave me my family back. You gave me my dignity back. I promise you, I will never take this second chance for granted." I folded the letter, placed it back into the envelope, and tucked it into the top drawer of my desk. I keep a few things in that drawer, quiet reminders of exactly why I put on this black robe every morning. People often ask me if doing this job for so many decades makes you cynical. The truth is, it can, if you let it. If you only see the law as a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. But true justice isn't just about punishing the guilty or enforcing contracts. It's about recognizing when a human being is doing their absolute best in a world that can be fundamentally unfair. It's about having the wisdom to know the difference between a person who is actively trying to cheat the system and a person who is just desperately trying to survive it. If I had ruled by the strict, unyielding letter of that corporate contract that day, I would have been 100% legally correct, but I would have been morally bankrupt. So, let me ask you this. Do you think I made the right decision? Should the law always be entirely black and white? Or does true justice require a human heartbeat? I want to know exactly what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read them all. If this story resonated with you, and if it reminded you that compassion still exists in this world, hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a case. We need accountability in this world, but we also need grace. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder today that second chances are real. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, take care of your families, and remember character counts. I'll see you in the next video.